Welcome to the Energy in Motion podcast, exploring what makes us move, what makes us thrive, what makes us happy, what keeps us alive. I'm Susie Rowland, a mother, writer, poet and founder of the Happy in School project. As humans, we are emotional beings, literally energy in motion, which each of us express uniquely. Our energies influence everything in our lives. Join me in conversation with an eclectic range of guests using their energies to powerful effect. Tune in for the first series of Energy in Motion podcast. You'll find the Energy in Motion podcast on your favourite digital download channels. I can't wait for you to tune in and relax and enjoy the sound of Energy in Motion. Hello, Professor Sam West. Thank you very much for joining myself and Pamela Akuli on Energy in Motion podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Just to remind people who haven't seen the first edition, although I know people have because they've actually said to me they've seen it and found it very, very helpful with their children. Professor Sam West is director of the Institute of Science in Early Years, a child psychologist and also a neuroscientist and many other things. And I wanted to have a chat with you today in response to the research I know that you were part of to the DFE around screen usage. So screen use, as we all know, is a big part of young children's lives and it's seen as something that they need for the future. But there are still important questions about how it might impact their development. So today I want to just kind of have a little bit more of a leisurely conversation behind the headlines and just look at, how screens do impact developing minds in early years, and also whether parent carers really need the state to tell them what to do and the tech companies, and how do we, regain authority when many of our little ones are already hooked. So that's kind of our sort of context. So just remind us, the three recommendations were no use of screens for under twos, an hour a day of screen time for under fives, and no social media for under fives either. So under twos, why not? What is happening to a 24-month-old brain developmentally, Sam?
Yeah, Susie, so that's a really good question. And I think the general big picture answer to a lot of the things that you've been saying, particularly about what's the role of the state to intervene in this type of thing, is because what we've been talking about a lot with the guidance is the needs of young brains are very, very different to the needs of older brains, i.e. the conditions under which younger brains learn best are very different to the conditions under which older brains learn best. And a lot of screen media content is designed for adults, and we're showing similar types of content to young children. And, from a neuroscience point of view and from a research point of view, there's a lot of ways in which it's impossible for parents to know that, we tend to assume, I do it with my own kids all the time, countless examples of ways in which I assume that what is optimal for my brain, what my brain kind of enjoys learning from, is the same as what, my three kids' brains is optimal for. And, in a lot of ways it's different. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And this is why I think, personally, I think it is important to be raising awareness about this, because there's no way for parents to, understand this just from kind of talking to and interacting with their kids. Yeah. So the big difference, Susie, is it all comes back down to this, a basic aspect of how our brains work, which is our brain's a prediction machine. So every word that I'm saying, your brain, it doesn't feel like it. It's a weird thought to think, but your brain is generating, like word by word, a prediction for what I'm going to say next. Yeah. So if I suddenly cabbage and say a word that's, unexpected in the context, then if I was measuring your brain activity, I would have had a little surprise response when I said that word cabbage. Yes. Yeah. So we know from this and lots of other studies that we're measuring context and we're making predictions. Yeah. And when we're listening to kind of language, we're making predictions based on all of the previous language that we've ever heard. Yeah. Similarly, when I'm looking around a scene, my eyes, every time I shift my eyes, I'm predicting what I'm going to see and hear next. Every time I bite into a carrot, and my brain is having a guess what the carrot's going to taste like. Yeah. And so one of the nice ways to illustrate this is that goes back to Teletubbies, one of the great kind of really got inside the mind of a toddler, really, I think neuroscience informed in a lot of really, really interesting ways. And there's one of the things that happens a lot in the Teletubbies is the scene where you go into this video on one of the Teletubbies' tummies, and you watch it for 2 minutes, and then it comes back to the Teletubbies, and they say again, again, and then you watch
Mm.
the same 2 minute video again, yeah, which for an adult is kind of very aversive, yeah, because the first time you watch it as an adult, yeah, your brain is very good at making predictions. So you can guess what's going to happen next, yeah, based on all of the different videos that you've watched in the past, yeah. So we make pretty good predictions the first time, yeah, and we learn from it pretty well the first time, yeah. So the second time we think, well, I've already extracted so much information, yeah, that there's no point in viewing it again, yeah. I'm not learning so much, so I don't want to view it again, yeah. This process of kind of making predictions, guessing what's going to happen next, and then testing whether that prediction was correct or not. That's all triggers dopamine release. So if we're learning, we find it rewarding. Yeah. First time, I get a lot of dopamine release. I learn a lot from watching it as an adult. The second time as an adult, I've already learned from it, so I don't get so much dopamine release, so I don't find it rewarding. Yeah. But for children, it's very, very different. Yeah. The first time, yeah, as an adult, I'm kind of guessing what's going to happen next based on all this prior knowledge. Children don't have that prior knowledge. Yeah. So
Mm.
they don't work so well at guessing what's going to happen next from one moment to the next. So they don't extract so much information from it the first time they watch it. And then the second time they watch it, they've just watched it. So they've got some more knowledge. So that means that they're better at making predictions. That means they actually learn more from it. So they pay more attention to it the second time. Yeah. So as a general principle, what we know is most of the world just simply happens too fast for children to keep up with, yeah, because they don't have this prior knowledge, yeah, they can't generate these guesses for what's going to happen next so well. So what they learn best from is repetition and familiarity, yeah, they learn best from doing the same thing over and over again, yeah. We also know that their brains are much slower than an adult's brain. So they've done some studies like the fastest rate that you can see in a adult, I can see up to 10 frames a second, so 10 flickers a second, yeah. Whereas in an 18-month-old, the fastest that they can see is one frame per second, yeah. So anything that's been and gone in less than a second is too fast for their brains to process. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
So the neuroscience is clear that the types of content that children learn best from is repetitious, yeah, doing the same thing over again, very predictable, doing kind of like predictable movements, reading the same book, even watching the same video over and over again, and slow paced, yeah.
Mm.
And in a lot of ways, yeah, these three things are what children aren't getting from screens. Yeah, screens tend to be much more fast paced from the real world. Yeah, and it's very hard. You can watch the same video over and over again, but very often, these YouTube algorithms are pushing us towards, watching one video and then there's something else, and then something else, and then something else. And there's also really, really good quality evidence that like the screen content that we make for young children is, getting more fast paced over time. So,
Yeah.
so basically, all of these issues are true for all young children. Yeah, this idea that they learn best from, slow pace, that they have problems keeping up with kind of fast paced content. Yeah, that's true for all children, but it's especially true for naught to twos. Yeah, the speed at which our brains work. In naught to twos, have got very little prior experience of this world. So this process of making these predictions, working out what's going to happen next, doesn't happen so well. So they really struggle to keep up. Yeah. And then the last thing, just on that, that is something that we look at in my research quite a lot is what happens when I'm watching content that is too fast paced that my brain can't keep up with. Yeah. And we know that when this happens, this kind of hardwired evolutionary mechanism kicks in that when I'm in a situation where my brain can't predict what's going to happen next, yeah, um, this kind of mechanism kicks in to say a brain sends a signal to our bodies, yeah, saying you're in a situation where you don't know what's going to happen next, so you better be able to respond at a moment's notice. So something called the fight or flight nervous system kicks in. So
Yes.
that's all
Yes.
about our heart beating faster, getting a big release of energy to our muscles and that type of stuff, yeah. So this is, developed as a survival mechanism. Yeah. Most of our development as a species, life's been pretty dangerous. We've actually had to run at a moment's notice. So if I'm in an unpredictable situation, it makes sense that my body is ready to respond at a moment's notice. Nowadays, it's not useful anymore because there aren't any predators out there anymore. And a lot of the time when children are experiencing this, fast-paced, unpredictable content, they're sat at home on their sofa watching an iPad, yeah. But we still have the same inbuilt mechanism, yeah. And fast-paced, unpredictable stuff puts us into fight or flight. So this is why kids are ratty when they come off screens. This we think this is why there is good quality now correlational evidence between the amount of screen time that children are watching and behavioral and behavioral and emotional dysregulation. And there are also quite a lot of papers coming out that we were reviewing, putting together the evidence on long-term correlations between the amount of screen use you have early on and what we call affective disorders, so anxiety and
Mm.
depression during later life. Yeah. And we think it might be due to this link. Yeah. If I'm spending a lot of time in this, hyper alert, high
Mm.
aroused, I can't keep up. I need to be able to ready to respond at a moment's notice. If I'm spending a lot of time in that state as a young kid, yeah, we think it can contribute to us, constantly being on knife edge, more likely to collapse into, dysregulation as a kid, and more likely to be kind of anxious when we're older. So that basically is why the recommendation was nothing at all for 0 to 2s, just because their brains are the most slow paced, and then kind of limits on the amount of screen exposure for older kids too.
Absolutely. So what you're saying in a summary, if I've got you correctly, is that the recommendations are important because the developing brain learns that way. So that's the repetition, and that's the way that the younger brains, younger than 24 months, they need that slower delivery. They need that repetition, and most importantly of all, they need to not be in their quote reptilian brain. They need to be in their prefrontal cortex, which is very underdeveloped at that point. So they can't spend too much time in that state of heightened emotion.
Yeah, basically. So, yeah, I mean, there's quite a few things I want to say to that, Susie. It's a good point. Nice summary. So, I mean, the first thing is, yeah, it's basically just a question that, as I mentioned, the ways that my kids learn best are different to the way that my 47-year-old adult brain learns best. Yeah. So, one example that I always think was when my son, he's 6 now, was when he first was about 4, we decided he could watch Netflix for the first time. Yeah. And when he first started watching, I would choose what he'd watch.
Mhm.
And then, put a show on and then give it to him to watch. And then after a few months, we decided that he was ready, that he could choose what he watched. And if you look back at the viewing history, it's really quite stark that when I was deciding what I was watching, I was always choosing different shows, always different episodes of different shows. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the minute he was able to choose for himself what he watched, he would always watch the same show and often watch the same episode again and again and again.
Yes,
This was
yes,
a few years ago. This was before I'd started thinking a lot about this, the importance of repetition for young
yeah.
brains. And this is just simply, I'm an adult. I want the best for my kid. Yeah. I want him to have the best time he can have. But I assume that the way what's best for him is best for me. So because my brain works best by always watching different content, I assume that that's what I give him. Yeah.
Mm.
Whereas in fact, when he gets a chance to choose, and also, when we get a chance to understand what's happening inside his brain, then it's very different. It's the same with everything. I was presenting the same thing to a bunch of librarians. Been presenting it quite a lot to librarians, and this Scottish librarian was saying that, Sam, you're really doing my head in, because it's so inbuilt into my like whole mindset that my job as a librarian is to encourage kids to be always reading a different book every time they come
Choosing
to
different
see me.
books.
And this idea, and it's something that you talk about a lot with early years practitioners too, because
Yes.
that when a kid's tottering over to you with this hopeful expression, with this book, holding this book, and you're like, oh my God, I've read
It's,
this book
it's,
300 times. I'm going to be physically sick if I have to read this book
yes,
again.
yes,
So it's
yes.
a really big part of lots of different aspects of early years practice, not just
Yeah.
screens.
Yes, we joke about it as adults, don't we? That when they read the book and you turn over the page of the Roald Dahl, and they know every word, they know every bit of and then she said this, and they kind of can lip they sort of I watched my children and they're lip reading as I'm going along, and they know all the words, all your expressions, and you think maybe it's just comforting. But what you're
Mm.
saying actually is that repetition is a key learning element. That's really important
Yeah,
to
yeah,
understand, and not being stressed out as well. So just moving on to the second question.
yeah.
Children love mastery over things like defeating baddies. So how
Mm.
can we replicate that sort of engagement and enjoyment and challenge offline?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different. There's a good question, Susie. There's a lot of different ways that we can think about this. I mean, one bit that I'm genuinely not sure about the answer to is I'm just writing a book on this and I'm reflecting on this at the moment that I was saying that like fast-paced, unpredictable content puts us into this fight or flight
Yeah.
mode.
Yeah.
And there's also good, really, really good quality evidence, tons of evidence that playing computer games where we're controlling a character who's in imagined danger, yeah, puts us into
Yeah.
fight or flight mode, yeah.
For sure.
Um, and the bit that I don't understand is why do we enjoy being in that mode? Like, why do we seek it out? Yeah.
Mm,
I get that when I've spent a lot of time in that state, yeah,
mm,
I kind of get used to being in that state. Yeah. So, when
mm.
you talk about this to early years practitioners, that they'll always be able to tell you about stories about kids who, you can tell that they have, quite an unpredictable life at home. Because, this idea of unpredictability that I've been talking about is not just about screens, it's also about parent-child interactions. Yeah. And then it's also about, the home environment generally. And there's a lot of evidence that, some children experience particularly unpredictable home environments. And that affects them in lots of different ways. But one of the ways it definitely does affect them is it affects your kind of set point for stress. Yeah, your kind of your
Mhm.
natural, your idling level. Yeah, if you think of it
Yes.
like an engine. Yeah,
Yeah.
and if I'm used to being in a home environment where I often have to react at a moment's notice something stressful that's happened, yeah, I might my it's part of the brain called the brainstem kind of starts to idle at that level. Yeah, so and you often hear early years practitioners, kids who have that type of home environment who are like that, when
Mm.
stuff gets a bit calm, in a nursery or at school,
They
you can see
create
them
some
kind of seeking
drama.
out a bit of stimulation.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they'll do something that they know they'll climb on a block that they've been told they're
Yeah.
not allowed to climb, and then they'll look at the practitioner saying, all right, what you can do about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That type
Yeah.
of thing. So so we know that if I'm used to being in a stressful situation, then playing something like a computer game when I'm controlling a character in an imagined danger um, um, will kind of put me in that mode. But the bit that I don't understand is I think it goes a bit deeper than that. I think, with my own kids, just watching them closely, it's not, most of our lives quite relaxing. We moved out of London. We live in quite a small town now, lots of fields around that type of stuff. And they're generally relatively relaxed. But like when something exciting comes up like screens, they're immediately drawn to it. Yeah.
Mm,
And
mm.
I don't really understand, I can't really articulate to what it is, why, you'd choose to spend
Yeah.
so much time. If you think about kids, spending hours and hours and hours playing Fortnite, they're spending hours and hours and hours in this fight or flight mode. The
Totally.
heart's
Yeah.
beating faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
often notice them, it's cold, but they're sweating.
They're
That's
sweating.
one of
Yeah,
the things.
that's my
Like,
son. Yeah, windows
that's
are
exactly.
open. Windows are open. Room's a little bit smelly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because he's sweating because it's fight or
He's been
flight.
on the
But
game, and
what?
I'm like, why is the window open? What is
Yeah,
gaming? Oh, okay. And yeah, he's completely adrenalized,
yeah,
completely.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I thought that was part of his ADHD profile, which I do believe it is because he met lots of online friends. But I think when I go into schools and I do training on online safety, and I have a slide and I just show logos, TikTok, Instagram, Roblox, just a couple of logos flash up on the screen. And in primary school, they go absolutely nuts
yeah,
just by looking at the logos. You're thinking it's like a doorway to the excitement. They kind of recognize it and they're there, and they're
yeah,
screaming. And I'm like, just a slide full of logos. What's going
yeah,
on here?
yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
very
so
strange.
that's the part of the story that I don't really understand, why we get drawn to stress, yeah, why we
Mm,
seek out stress.
mm,
Um, the one thing that I think is, um, you know, so I think that it's from a research point of view, the literature on computer games is much more mixed than the literature on TV in terms of kind of benefits versus kind of upsides versus downsides. Well, you mentioned earlier about this kind of the link. I can't remember the link. What you're kind of missing out on when you get a screen. So one of the things that I think is important with
yes.
different ways of using screens is that videos are very passive. Yeah. So when you're watching a TV, yeah, you're basically just tracking the movement. Yeah? So we have inbuilt, this automatic mechanism that helps us to pay attention to movement. Yeah. And again, it's for evolutionary reasons. It used to be a threat detection system that, if there's movement anywhere in our visual field, we automatically pay attention to it. Yeah. Um, Nowadays, again, it's not useful because we don't have predators in our environments anymore, but it's hardwired in our brains to pay attention to movement.
Yeah.
So this is why everyone finds it relaxing to watch TV at the end of the day because you don't have to choose to pay attention. Yeah. So this automatic attention mechanism happens really low down in the brain, right at the bottom
Yes.
here.
Yes.
Just watch everyone's moving. And then the voluntary attention is, up here under the frontal cortex. And this is
Cortex. Yeah.
the bit that's us choosing what we pay attention to. Yeah. You don't have
Absolutely.
to use this choosing when you're viewing screens. Yeah. Which
Yes.
is why we find it relaxing. And that's one of the reasons why we think, there's certainly quite a lot of correlation evidence linking high screen exposure to things like ADHD. It's probably just because, when you're spending a lot of time in this very passive mode, yeah,
Mhm.
where you're just following the movement, you don't get as much chance to practice,
Yes.
controlling your own behavior by,
Yes.
paying
Yes.
attention to things. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
so that's true for video, but it's less true for games because games, a lot of the time, you do have to do quite a lot of planning.
You
Yeah.
do.
So to
You do.
play, Fortnite, for example, you
Yeah.
have to, you use, it's not just you passively watching the movement. You have to be
Absolutely.
doing working out what the rules of a game are, generating hypotheses, testing them, and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And it actually fits that the literature on the upsides and downsides of video game playing on brain development is much more nuanced. There's definitely quite a lot of evidence for upsides as well as downsides, whereas there's less evidence for upsides from watching kind of video.
Absolutely.
So that's fine. But the point about spending a lot of time in a high stress state, I wouldn't say there's upsides for that, but I don't. I just don't know about that. I can't give you an explanation for why they're so drawn to the high stress state, but they certainly seem to
Yeah.
be.
They
The only
certainly
other thing to
do.
say about that is I am too.
Yes.
I'm addicted to anything. When I get a thing saying, "Can you go on the radio to talk about this?" Like it still makes me nervous, but I
Yeah.
always say
Yeah.
yes, and I'm sure it's that same thing, just
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna invite Pamela just to share your experience. So you, Pamela Akuli, is you're a guest of you're not a guest, you're a founder of Just Like Me Stories and Mixed Reality. And so you have created augmented reality storybooks for primary age children at the moment, and where the images in the books are animated by the use of an app. So talk me through how that works and how what have you witnessed since you've seen it in, with your own children?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for those who may be unaware what augmented reality is, or AR for short, it's a type of technology that basically adds digital things like images, animations, or sounds on top of the real world. So you may have used it, for example, if you've gone to IKEA, and they used to have an app where it means that you could go into your living room and download an app, and then suddenly you'll be able to see the bed that you saw on their website in your bedroom, so you could see it in the real world. So it's digitally overlaying in the real world. So it's very different from virtual reality, which is 100% in a virtual reality environment. So the way that we use augmented reality is very intentional. So we use it in children's books and learning resources. And the reason that we used it is because I'm a mother of three boys, and my eldest son, Walter, is autistic and he was non speaking until the age of 8. And we really struggled to find books and resources that supported his needs. And as all of us parents are aware, regardless of a child's ability, they are kind of hyper fixated on screens. Screens is like that kind of thing that kind of alerts them and captivates them. And the same was for my son, but in a very different kind of way. So we realized that Walter was going towards his tablet time and time again and again, back to that repetition. He was watching the same animations and programs. And then he started to tap on the characters or mimic the sounds. And for a child who is non-speaking, that was a huge milestone for us. And we started to witness how he was almost trying to talk with the animations, tap on the sounds, and also almost become part of that character. And that was huge for us. So I thought, what would it look like if we could combine both of those two worlds? So we still have a book. Um, I write the children's books, and first and foremost, the book is the key. It is so important. But also, we need to recognize that not every individual or child can pick up a book, read that information, understand that information, and retain that information as well. So we thought, how can we take the beauty of a book, but then digitally overlay it with animation and sound and 3Ds, gamification in there as well, so that children are no longer just kind of like passive readers, they become like very much active participants in the story. And we've written the story so that you can literally, you would not know that it's an augmented reality book. It looks the same as every other children's book out there. But if you do have children who are maybe disengaged with traditional books, or have or neurodivergent learners, and they need maybe a little bit more assistance, and they need that kind of audio or kinesthetic and doing something as they're reading, or they respond very much to audio cues and things like that, we've realized that augmented reality kind of taps into all those different learning journeys for that individual reader. And it's such a joy to see. And I'll be completely honest with you, before I had children, I was 100% adamant that I would have tech-free children, so no screens or anything like that. And then I realized how this technology was such a kind of gateway and portal for my son's learning and development and confidence and his enthusiasm. And he's gone from a non-speaking to a child who's talking all the time. And more importantly, he loves books in all different formats, whether it's audiobooks, whether it's normal traditional books, whether it's our AR books that he absolutely loves. But we've realized that it adds another layer of curiosity. And also, if you have got complex storylines or things that, children are not naturally kind of able to digest, the augmented reality allows you to adapt to that by adding animation and by adding gamification and things like that. And through school trials, we've realized that it's massively increased retention levels and reading for pleasure. And it's allowed children to become really, really curious. And I think intentionality is the key when you're developing things like this. So with our app, it's not a case of you place your phone or tablet over the book and then, yeah, you see the character move and that's kind of like, yeah, that's really cool. It's really intentional. So we're getting the child to literally read the story, respond to the story, touch on certain things. So they've got that kind of learning through play as well and development. And I think that's what's really key. And then we write the stories so that we encourage the child to kind of almost like go back into the real world. So, whether that could be like, okay, yeah, so the character's been playing drums and you get to actually play drums with the character. That's really great. What could you find in your house that could, cause some noise? Or do you mean go outside and name 3 things that you can see, smell, and touch, and all those kind of things as well. So I don't think it's a case of it has to be books or technology. We're starting to see that the two can work together, but you have to be really intentional with the use of that.
Yeah, that sounds great, Pamela. Can I just, so basically what the explanation I'd give for, why it works from a kind of neuroscience point of view is basically, I mean, because exactly what you were saying. So it sounds, sorry, I forgot your son's name. You mentioned it in the passing.
Yeah, Walter.
Walter.
Yeah.
So basically, so I was mentioning that, these multimodal clues, kind of the movement and the sound, kind of help capture our attention. So what I would say was the reason that you were finding that Walter was initially struggling with books, I guess, was because, and this is very common with children with kind of different forms of autism, but he'll struggle to kind of control the focus of his attention. If there's not something there to help attract his attention, draw it, like something kind of moving or some beeping, he'll find it harder to get there on his own. So it's kind of making it easier to sustain attention to the book by building something on top of it. But then what's really interesting is that you say that doing this has helped Walter to make the transition to other kind of types of books as well. And this is back to what you mentioned earlier, that he with the if he can get a very high level of repetition, so he can get to the point where the book has been made engaging enough for him to interact with it by putting these other modalities on top, so he can get there. Once he can do that again and again and again, it becomes familiar enough to him that he can start to predict what's going to happen next. And then you can take away the crutches. It's like putting kind of bells on something to make it more attractive. And then once I get used to paying attention to it, then you can get away with the bells, and they can do that. So that's really, really great. I mean, generally, I think there's another actually quite interesting. It's making me think when you were talking about it, about I often talk to present it to earliest practitioners about with children with profound autism, so non-verbal children with autism, that they it's the same thing with prediction. So I was saying, you know, when stuff's very fast paced and we struggle to predict. And that's also true with interpersonal interactions. And a lot of children with autism kind of struggle to predict how someone's going to react before they react. And one of the really nice things is they've done some robots where they've just got a Connect controller, you know, that motion tracker that
Yeah.
I don't know if they stopped making them, but basically they just gave these children a robot that exactly copied every movement that you did physically. Yeah. And again, these children spent thousands and thousands of hours like repeating this to the point where it got predictable. Yeah. Their brains were struggling to predict what's going to happen next, but through this repetition, and that helped them to make the bridge to other, you know, more complex forms of interaction. So it's exactly what you've been doing with the books. It
Yeah.
sounds fantastic.
Thank you.
Mm,
Thank you.
definitely. So is that a good use of tech, do you think, for the developing brain? You know what, and
Yeah.
I think what I particularly like about the augmented reality model is that I guess to start off with, the child will work with their adult or they'll read the book with their adult. So you've got the parental engagement aspect as well, which I think is part of the recommendations, isn't it, for the young?
Yeah. So that's one area where there is a really strong evidence base for co-viewing. And, you know, that's for lots of reasons. Firstly, because it allows it to be more child-led, certainly in the context of a book. So reading a book together is a really nice way where you can be quite child-led. So it's not so much when you're reading a book to a child, it's not so much, you know, you sit and read it and the child has got to keep quiet and listen. Yeah. Which is basically the model with screen content, that the screen's content just happens and the child has to keep up. Yeah. Books are much more child-led in that, you know, you have whether you go forward or back or how long you spend on a particular page is dependent on lots of different cues for the children. So that's great, and that's one thing that's great about what you're doing, Pamela. In terms of the evidence for co-viewing on screens generally, I just was having a guy. We're just issuing putting together some guidance on 0 to 2s, which is going to
Mm,
be it's kind of like a early years
mm,
coalition. So all the different early years partners were there, and we were just having a debate today about we'd put in some stuff about co-viewing with 0 to 2s is okay because it gives them a chance to
mm,
um you know, it gives them a chance to talk about what they've been watching. So you can be putting verbal labels onto what they've been watching, and
mm,
that type of stuff. So the evidence on co-viewing with screens is different. It's more about the language, using it as as a stimulus to language. Yeah.
mm.
But with books, it's more about being child-led.
Absolutely. I think just going back to the guidelines for a minute, Sam, we've got really different devices. When we talk about screens and screens for under fives and under twos, I think it's worth identifying what we mean by screens. I mean, we've got television screens, we've got iPad screens, and then phone screens. And then within those screens, we've got also different types of content. So can you just break that down for us a little bit in terms of the guidelines? Because it's not the same kind of content
No, and I
or
think that
use.
yeah, so the content is particularly important. So, you know, what I've been saying, you know, particularly important is this idea of, you know, when stuff is just happening too fast at a rate that my brain can't keep up with. Yeah. Um, and that is, you know, true for some forms of TV, but it's not true. It's true for some forms of kind of video content, but it's not true for others. Yeah. So, you know, good CBBS, you know, particularly the older CBBS, things like In the Night Garden, is really, really slow paced. Yeah. To a
Mm.
point where it's quite aversive to watch as an adult. But again, it's, you know,
Yes.
done off this. Anne Wood, it was the same person who did Teletubbies who did Night Garden, and it's done off this real intuitive feel of what the world feels like to a young kid.
Yeah.
Um, so the slow pace stuff is fine, and I pushed really hard, and it's actually quite strongly represented in the guidance that, you know, fast paced stuff best to avoid. Kind of slow paced, kind of predictable stuff is best to kind of watch. And if you think what they're seeing when they're doing FaceTime, yeah, um, then you know, that's just a face interacting with them. So if I can predict what a face is going to do when I'm interacting with it live, then it's not a different thing to looking at, you know, doing FaceTime or kind of video calling. So that's a very different type of thing. As I mentioned, kind of games are different in terms of how your brain's reacting. It's not just passive, it's much more interactive, which is good. But I think actually, funny enough, Susie, because the on different types of device, it's actually quite a different thing. So obviously, since iPhones and iPads in 2009, 2010, there's been a massive increase, particularly in early years screen use. And for
Mm,
obvious reasons, you're in a queue at a shop or you're waiting for your food to come at a restaurant and, you've got a
mm,
3-year-old and, you just want a minute's silence. So you put out your phone and put Peppa Pig in and then you can have a glass of wine, chat to your friends. So there have been massive increases in the amount of screen use since that came out, just for the ubiquity of screens. But one of the
mm,
things that I think is not so widely recognized is this idea of kind of passive screen use. So we think about this a lot at home because I've been working on this guidance for a few months now, and in the evenings I like to sit and watch the football with my wife. We just kind of sit and have it on and have a nice chat about our days as the football's on. We've got a 6-month-old baby, and it's virtually impossible to position a 6-month-old baby in a room where you've got a TV on showing a football with her not being able to see the screen. And the minute she can see it, she just glues on it because of this mechanism I said of the
yes.
you follow the movement. We have
You're
this
tracking the
hardwired.
ball.
Yeah, you're tracking it, but you have a hardwired thing just to follow the
Yes.
movement. Yeah. So, but even if I have her like on my lap facing towards me, she'll look like this over the top of her head at the screen like that. So we've been thinking about it, and this research into passive TV in the background consumption is much, much, much less. Most of the research on screens is, the child is sitting, watching it primarily. But I think there's some really, really important stuff to do. But that's more of a problem with, wall-mounted TVs, because
Mm,
obviously an iPad's much smaller. So if I'm watching it, my baby's less likely to catch it in the line of
mm,
sight. So there are a lot of kind of differences between different types of content. But as I say, the main one is what are they viewing on the screen? The screens are the medium, not the message. It's not about screens themselves. It's about how they're using the screens. And
yes. And
there are
what's on
certain
it?
ways of using screens which I'd say are really good for children's development. And there are other
Absolutely.
ways which I say I certainly wouldn't be keen for my kids to do.
Absolutely. So we've got many diverse brain types, as we know. We've already mentioned autism and ADHD, and these different diverse brain types process information differently. And in some cases, tech or ed tech, educational technology, is a really powerful learning tool for younger learners who may be ADHD or dyslexic or any of the other neurotypes. So, are we okay with that? And does the screen use preclude those groups of children, or is it a universal guideline?
Mm. Um, so it's very much something that is I think you're absolutely right, Susie, that there are a lot of benefits, particularly, and this was something that came through very strongly in the consultation. There are a lot of benefits um, for children with SEND that they get from screens. Two, in particular, this idea of kind of repetition. So I was saying that, naturally our brains are wired to seek out predictability. But then at the rate, so early on we need repetition because we don't have so much prior experience, so everything's more novel, so we need to repeat stuff. And then as we get more experienced and we can predict something, then it stops triggering so much learning, so it gets boring, so we seek
Mm,
out something new. So that's all run by dopamine release, like curiosity-based learning from dopamine release. But obviously the rate at which our brains are learning and the rate at which things are getting too predictable and we seek out something different varies a lot from child to child. Yeah. And so this idea, so some children will stay much longer, in this kind of phase of needing a lot of repetition than others. Yeah. Every child, there's differences between every
yeah.
child. And that's something obviously that tech's very good for. I
Mm,
can, watch the same video over and over again if that's what I need for where I am at my learning journey.
mm,
And no, certainly for the point of view of, a teacher teaching phonics with
mm,
iPads in a classroom, what's really great is that everything is all the learning is best off contingency. Yeah, so I get feedback, and then if I've got the answer right, I go into a new question. If I haven't got it wrong right, then I consolidate and I repeat more at that level. Yeah. So
mm,
all teaching is, what is the level that is my class. But if I've just got one teacher and 30 kids, then I need to
mm,
pitch that level of difficulty at the average level for all of the
mm,
30 kids. Yeah. And
mm,
one of the things that's great about tech is that I can have 30 kids doing a phonics app on their iPad at once. And
mm,
that level of difficulty of the task that they're being presented with is individually calibrated for that individual
mm,
child. Yeah.
mm,
So that's something that tech is great for. This idea that I can, get a lot of feedback is very contingent, it's very child led. I'm constantly monitoring where the child's at on their learning journey and I'm giving stuff that's exactly right for their difficulty
mm.
level.
Mm.
So that's, a massive potential. So those are two areas I'd say where, children with kind of different forms of neurodivergence can benefit from tech. Yeah, kind of
Mm.
children who needing different levels of repetition and that, tailoring learning to different speeds. And
Yeah.
then there's another thing, obviously, there's a lot of discussion. There's a great book, Neurotribes, about kind of tech and autism. And that is also talking about the fact that, as I was mentioning, a lot of people with autism find interpersonal interactions particularly hard, and they're trying to guess how a person's going to kind of respond in a given situation. And obviously, one of the nice things about kind of tech is that it's more systematizable. So, some like
Yes.
really, really, really smart people with autism can work out like a complex technological system, and they can work out exactly how a system's going to react at a given time. But
Mm.
they kind of find it harder to predict how a person's going to react. So
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
you're letting people spend time in the situations that where their brains can predict what's going to happen next, where they do, amazing things. So yeah, lots of benefits.
Yeah, definitely. So, in summary, do you know, have you got any feedback on how the guidelines have been received by parent carers? And what's
Yeah.
next? What's next? I mean, how do we enforce, measure the impact of these recommendations? And, are we looking at preventing some potentially adverse mental health impacts, for example?
Yeah. So I'll answer the last question first. So uh, it's very hard to be sure, and we've talked about this a lot when we were putting together the guidance. But as I say, we're in a situation where we know that screen content, fast-paced, unpredictable screen content, has this effect on our overall levels of kind of arousal and alertness. Um, and we have a lot of really good quality evidence that kind of these things kind of correlate with behavioral dysregulation and then long-term kind of mental health. And we've got some causal evidence. So we've shown, you can do some kind of animal models where you can randomly assign one group to receive, high intensity kind of visual stimulation and another not. And that's kind of consistent with this model that the high intensity visual stimulation like affects our brainstem function, which kind of has associations with, anxiety like behaviors later on. So I think this is something that we need to think about. The one tricky area where, I'm being really frank and saying I just don't know what the picture is at the moment is, why is it that we're seeking out these situations? If they don't feel nice, why do we seek them out? Yeah. Um, so that's one thing that we do. But the other thing is more of a regulatory thing, which is, so as I mentioned earlier, there's been this quite marked shift in the past, 20 years towards faster paced content. Yeah. In fact,
Mm.
it's been happening since we started making movies. So there's
Yeah,
stuff going back to the 1920s, very first movies we ever made. If you look at things like cutting speed and just the rate of
absolutely.
change of stuff happening on screen, it's getting faster and faster over time. Yeah. Um, and one of the reasons we think this is happening is because we have, as I mentioned earlier, this hardwired tendency to pay attention to movement anywhere we can see it. And what the makers of screen content are doing is they're increasingly realizing that if I tap into this, hardwired low down brain mechanism, then everybody watches it. Yeah. It doesn't matter if
Yeah,
I don't understand it, everybody
yeah,
watches it all the time. Yeah. Whereas
yeah.
this kind of comprehension, understanding driven engagement, which is what, Pamela was talking about earlier, which is what you get with books. Yeah. You get it too with slow paced TV. Yeah. So something like In the Night Garden. Yeah. There's a lot of the time, there's hardly any movement to draw your attention. Yeah. It's only when I've watched a few episodes and I understand what's happening and I'm interested and I recognize the characters that I want to pay attention to it. Yeah. So for this kind of slow paced, the stuff that we think is good for the brain, yeah, the slow paced screen content, yeah, you have this bump. But the first time I watch it, I'm just like, what is that? And then only when you get to know it and talk about it with someone that you get interested in it, yeah. Whereas with the fast pace, look at me, there's movement, yeah, that works straight away, yeah. So when you see it that way, you can understand why the makers of screen content are,
Mm.
moving more towards this fast paced, look at me stuff, yeah. But it's also, we're pretty sure now it's not what children need, particularly very young children. Yeah. So for me, the next question is how do we legislate this? Yeah. This is partly about, parental advisory, and, there is advice and a guidance about how to tell good quality content from less good quality content. Yeah. But it's also, I think, a legislative thing that, and it's partly also communicating with the makers of screen content. So we're doing lots of that, talking about this. This is why you find it works. But, this is also why, we think it's not great for young children's brains. But if there's any way, and this is the one we haven't been able to come up with, like any way we can, legislate for this. Yeah. So how do we make it that, we're protecting, in the same way that, there's a lot of legislation about foods, stuff that we know is harmful for us, we're not allowed to put into food. Yeah. So is there any way that we can do the same type of stuff with this, fast-paced kind of screen content that we think, we've got pretty good evidence now is, not good for young children's brains?
It does seem like it's taken a long time to get to this point and to get to the research. And I think as parents, we've kind of known instinctively, like you were saying, Pamela, you were convinced you're going to be that parent, you weren't going to be that parent that would give your kids an iPad on the journey on the motorway. My mother, I think I'm a bit older than you, but my mother would say, look out of the window and count the number of red cars. That was my level of entertainment. And also,
Yeah.
I also think that while I'm doing these podcasts, I need to be putting on makeup, putting on, doing something crazy with my hair because talking to the camera doesn't seem to be enough. You also have to do other things as well to get people's attention. I don't know if you've watched any TikTok, but it is as fast as it gets. I mean, literally there are
Yeah.
colors, there's music, there's sound, there's constant movement, there's constant talking, and it actually gives me a headache. I mean, I just find it very unpleasant and kind of slightly nauseating, not physically nauseating. But clearly, loads of kids. I mean, in secondary schools, if you're not on TikTok in year seven, what's wrong with you? So
Yeah.
I think whatever we're doing now to kind of start with the next generation in terms of, thinking about how they are learning, how they are adapt, their brains are changing, they're desirous of more stimulus, and we need to kind of arrest that process. It feels like a whole generation has already gone through that exposure of that speed and that kind of frantic, highly aroused, highly stimulated. So in a way, it's a bit late for that generation, but we know we're all managing that as best we can. But
Yeah.
I do I do think I personally think it's important to have this research, and it's important to have these conversations and try and understand, well, I think for parents perhaps need more information. The stuff we discussed today, it's not just a banning thing, no screens under twos and only an hour for under fives. It's because it will damage their ability to learn. They may struggle to concentrate when they go into school. They may find it hard to follow instructions. It may be more difficult to identify those children who are neurodivergent, for example, from the general population because everyone is completely having the same presentations. It might take longer to identify. So I think I welcome the research, and I'm very interested to see how it's going to be rolled out and what comes next as a parent and a practitioner. And I'm sure you are as well, Pamela,
Yeah,
with
definitely.
with your augmented reality books. So thank you so much for your time, both of you. Really appreciate it. And I will share the links once it's out, and all of your information and links to the research will be in there as well. And thank you very much for joining the Energy in Motion. How are you both feeling now? What's your energy level now, Sam?
Great, lovely.
Great.
My kids, I'm about to go and jump on top of my kids. So yeah, I'm feeling happy. That was great though.
Fantastic.
Nice chat. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks, Susie.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, take care. See you, Pamela. See you, Sam. Thank you. Bye bye.